Antiquities were the love of Emily Foster's life, the ancient, of the forgotten, and all that which lurks in shadows. Therefore she came across a little dingy antique shop that was tucked away in the corner of some long-forgotten part of town, which naturally meant having to go inside. The shop was dimly lit and smelled of musty wooden books, overlaid with a suspicion of something else. As she made her way through the narrow spaces, Emily spotted a glass case full of porcelain dolls. Some were broken, others without limbs, but each was unsettling in its own way. One doll caught her eye. It was in the middle of the cupboard, its dust-white dress oddly pristine against all that mess. The glassy blue eyes of the doll tracked her across the room in a clinical manner. There was something mesmerizing and deeply disturbing about the doll. It was as if she could feel it watching her, like it had been there all along. The band on its wrist read, "Maddie, I hear the old man behind a withered-up apple coming from an opaque storekeeper." "Ah, you found her?" croaked. Emily looked up, startled. "Who is she?" "That doll," said the man, and his voice quavered ever so slightly. "This was a dark entity. Others have had their hold, but none can hang gates around her for very long. They say she's cursed." Curiosity pulled at Emily, tendrils that wound down her nose and into the air. She grew up on the morbid side of life. This doll was just another thing to collect. "How much?" Where the man had told her to be cautioned not to, she asked. The man behind the counter shifted uneasily from side to side, and his eyes flicked around the room. "I will give her to you free and clear, if in fact she is what you want," said eerily, as though anxious it was. Emily took the doll from Emily, her hands so frantic they were shaking as she left. But the idea this innocent-looking purchase was going to turn her life into a nightmare she had never imagined. In her room, Emily put the doll up on a shelf and liked how it made the place feel more ghostly. But as soon as Madeline stepped foot in her home, more bizarre things started to happen. It was slow at first, hardly noticeable. Sometimes things would shift slightly in her house or go missing, showing up later where she knew they were not. The lights flickering for no reason. In the room they kept her doll, and there was always a chilling draft that blew through it, despite all the windows being shut. And then one night, a sound like a heavy blow roused Emily from sleep. She sat up in bed with a start, her heart pounding. It was dark, so we sat inside, but enough moonlight peeked through the window and stretched long shadows across the walls. Her hand grasped for the small screen in front of her and lit up a dim light throughout what little room they entitled to being their own. The doll from the other side of the room had fallen off that shelf by her bed and was now laying on its head at an angle near where her feet would be. Emily's blood ran cold. There was no way she had moved it. Could swear to that. She picked it up with shaking hands and placed on the shelf, telling herself that maybe someone knocked it down, but she isn't sure how. But over the next couple of days, these happenings ballooned in number and got much more sinister. Emily heard the soft laugh of a child ring through the halls that connected each apartment. And yet, when she ventured out from behind her front door, young Tommy's voice was nowhere to be found. She watched the doll's eyes that she had always believed looked so real. Now they appeared to be watching her with an intensity that made her flesh crawl. She dismissed away these occurrences as figments of her imagination, but at the back of mind she knew it was something sinister. But the doll was no ordinary antique. It was something else, inescapably evil. Weeks passed, and Emily's life started to claim her, haunted her dreams. And she lay awake many nights, fearing that doll would wake up with a face of beauty now twisted into wickedness. Soon, the laughing was just outside her door, and she would wake up in the middle of night to find that doll sitting by her bedside, now facing towards where had been sleeping. We were completely removed from the situation with Emily, and we could still see it happening. She grew reclusive and terrified, sleepless. Now Maria had spilled her secret to Sarah months later, and while she was doubtful about the doll part of it happening just as described, she did not like that look in Eugene's eyes. "Emily, you're just incredibly stressed out. You know, you should just toss the doll if it's that much of a nuisance." As much as Emily wished it was a dream, she had to face the fact her biggest fears were coming alive. Disheartened, she brought the doll back to the store where it was found. Arriving at the place where it had resided, she beheld an empty building. Deserted, it was as if the antique store had never been there. Not a trace of it. Emily flew like a bat out of hell to her apartment and knew she was trapped from the second she entered. The air was heavy with an evil presence, and the doll sat in a chair amid the carpeted living room floor as though it had been expecting her. Afraid, Emily grabbed the doll and ran outside. She drove to the closest bridge and screeched with one last maniacal howl. She threw the damned doll into an angry abyss of a river. She stood silent as it sunk into the water well beyond her hopes of release from its greedy clutches. It was like it again for a few days. The unexplained happenings ceased, and Emily returned to her normal self. However, that reprieve was short-lived. That night, as she was going to bed, quiet and familiar giggle resounded in the air. Her blood turned to ice. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But when she got into bed with a chill and sharp object beside the covers, Emily pulled the blankets back with shaking hands and found Madeline, her dress soaked through with mud but looking just as beautiful in death. Into the glassy eyes of that doll, its first expression came to a flicker. She screamed and flung the doll across the way, but it landed in a squat position as though gently set down. And just like that, could it be the alcohol? Emily's heart was in her throat, and she felt cold as icicles. Flickering lights around them, she felt as though she was paralyzed, tried to walk, even run, but somehow couldn't. Next sibling, Kupik's N. Its small feet tapped on the hardwood floor as it slowly advanced towards her, the laughter uniting, echoing off the walls until it built into a roar. Emily's eyes crossed as the room spun around her, and she fell to the floor, swallowed up by nausea and fear. In the darkness of her room, she saw perhaps a dozen shining eyes looking down at her, from where the doll stood over top. Its tiny voice was the last thing she heard before blacking out, whispering to her, "Inside of they were born Emily, you can't get rid of me. We are tied for all eternity." The next morning, Emily woke up on the floor in her room with the doll still clutched tightly to her chest. She was stiff in her body and fuzzy in the mind with fear and confusion. She knew she had to learn of it, what it was, where it came from, and why these haunting images. For weeks she obsessed over cursed objects, devoting hours in the library and on the internet trying to find any reference of Madeline. It took her days to find it, but finally she found an old, worn-out book in the restricted section of the library. Curse item entries and follow-ups, with the stories of those poor people who had to deal with that cursed item again. One passage caught her eye. There was a story about a doll that had been created in the late 19th century by Madeline's mourning mother, Madison, whose daughter somehow got killed, and she wanted to make sure Madeline remained with her forever, that her daughter was kept alive, albeit in doll-like form, because the mother practiced some cursed form of witchcraft that bound what she could of a spirit to an object. Instead of being a song in her daughter's heart, ritual had done something horrible, twisted the girl's spirit and somehow left it prisoned inside that doll, while malefic energies fed upon terror. It told of the doll that never wanted to be separated from her owner once it had grabbed a hold of them. There was only one way to end the curse, and that required breaking the doll in a ritual. Just then, spirit got released from all dolls. However, the ritual was very risky, and if you did it wrong, your owner could die, or worse. Emily knew she had no choice. Risk or no risk, she had to do the ritual. She created a circle of salt, arranged the candles, and his personal item before following the directions inside. She went back home, afraid and resolved. She set the doll in the middle of it, then lit all around. The room grew cold as she started to chant the words from the book that sparked crawling shadows around her. Those eyes of the doll started to come alight with a very unnatural crimson light, along with that sickly giggle felt as if it thundered through him this time. Emily's voice shook with the words, tremor of concentration as thick darkness filled one room. The doll started jerking and convulsing, the small limbs thrashing as though it was trapped inside of a circle. Worst of all, her voice grew louder and was nearing an ending crescendo. Zaviani rotit.